Let me just take a quick moment and introduce myself. My name is Nicole Medor. I'm the Early Childhood Specialist at the Department of Education, and I've got a few other colleagues that are joining us today that I hoped would introduce themselves. So Andrea, if you are there, do you want to pop in?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Logan, and I'm the Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Specialist here at the Department of Education.
Thank you. And we have some other colleagues as well, Jen and Marnie. I know Marnie's having some internet struggles, but Marnie, if you're able to say hello, that would be great.
So I'm Marnie Morneau, and I work for the University of Maine Center for Community Inclusion and Disability Studies as an Equity, Inclusion, and Access Consultant.
Thank you. And Jen, are you there?
I am. Hi, everyone. Jen Maverde. I work with Marnie at the University of Maine Center for Community Inclusion and Disability Studies, and I provide infant and early childhood mental health consultation throughout the state.
Welcome, everybody that was able to come today.
Jump right in with a little pre-assessment. Okay, so this is like a pre-assessment entrance ticket, kind of framing a little bit of kind of the direction we're going to be heading in over the course of the next 6 weeks. And so it is called, Who Are the Students in Your Class?
The idea of the activity ultimately being that you sort of randomly generate a class of students, of 6 students. Each roll of the dice, as in the pamphlet on that table, you can see, you know, if you roll a 1, the that student's profile, if you roll a 2, etc. And each one is a little different. So it's sort of a way of getting just an imaginary class together with diverse needs, a class that you may or may not experience day to day in your work now. And so as we work through thinking about how to include all children, how to make accommodations, modifications for all children, that's sort of the class we'll keep in mind. Point being that some of us in our settings don't have a diverse class like that. And so thinking about accommodations and modifications could potentially be a lot easier. So we want to make sure that there's that challenge and there's that activity to sort of stretch your thinking as we move forward.
Okay, so if you would like to follow along with the slides that are appearing on your screen, you could navigate to slide 13 in your companion guide. So if you go to slide 13 in the workbook / companion guide, all of the slides that we are going to go through are there for you. And there's also a place where you can take notes if you choose to on digitally, or you can do it on your own. It's really up to you, but it's there for you if you want it. Okay, so in this session 1, we're really just going to do some high point MTSS overview, right? And so we're going to just really take a nice high level view of MTSS and what it is and what the critical components that go into an MTSS framework. We're also going to talk a little bit about what MTSS is not, because there are some misconceptions that exist out in the world where folks think that it is one thing when in reality it is actually maybe similar, maybe in the same ballpark, but not exactly what it is that they're thinking. And we're also going to cover some why MTSS fails more than it succeeds, right? And so there are some parts of an MTSS framework that we tend to assume or take for granted. And because we assume these things and take for granted, I believe that is actually contributing to all of this effort that you're putting into MTSS and why you're not seeing the results that you're hoping to get. So you spend all this time doing this framework and then feeling like it's really not worth your time or not getting you anywhere. And so by the end of this session, you will be able to describe what MTSS is and what it isn't. And we wanted to provide an opportunity for folks that like to extend their thinking or like to produce something to kind of work through their thought processes and their understanding. And so this is a challenge by choice opportunity. There's a couple of bullet points on the objectives slide where we give you a couple of ideas of things that you could produce or create to help work through your thinking. So like a 10-second elevator speech, or a vision board that represents MTSS. My favorite is write a persuasive letter to a school board member about why your district should adopt district-wide or school-wide MTSS. So things like that. Those are not required. They're simply challenge by choice. They're there for you if you want them. Okay, so before we even get too far into what is MTSS, we'd like for you to reflect a little bit on what you already know about MTSS. So for the next 3 minutes in your workbook on page, what is it, 26, I think, 25? What we'd like you to do is answer the question, what is MTSS? And if you can, try to hit on the 5 W's and the how. So the what is it, who is it for, when do you use it, where does it happen, why does it happen, and how does it work? And this is an individual activity, so we will be quiet while you reflect in your own space. So you'll want to keep the answer that you came up with handy, because as you go through the training today, you may find that you want to do some revising of your answer. And because we're not collecting these, we don't even see these, really you can revise as much as you want. And so that space is for you to kind of track what you know now, or what you are aware of now, and what you know in the next 90 minutes or so. Okay, so moving on to slide 14 of the companion guide, and we're going to talk about MTSS Overview and Framework Components. So MTSS is one of our many educational acronyms that stands for Multi-Tiered Systems of Support. And I would just make note of the S on systems, right? Because that actually is a very important part of this acronym, because we're not necessarily talking about just one approach to something. We're actually talking about how we layer approaches to solve problems and to reach goals within our school or educational settings. And so the S on systems is actually quite important. And so what does all that mean? I mean, what is a multi-tiered system of support, and what does that mean for me? Well, what it means is that we focus on building systems that support all children, not just struggling children. And here's another piece of it, all educators, not just some educators. And that's another important part too, because I'm not talking here about education evaluators or evaluation systems. I'm actually talking about support systems for those educators and for all educators, not just a select few like special educators or ed techs. How do they all work and create this system and function within this system, and what are the supports that we're giving to them? Now, there are 5 critical components to a well-developed multi-tiered system of support. And some of these break down into additional subcomponents, but we're going to talk about just the high levels, right, of the 5 right now. And so the first one is team leadership, and specifically shared team leadership, where the team is developed and designed in such a way that everybody is taking a part and has an active role. Nobody is passive in the team, in the shared team leadership world. And then the team leadership actually breaks down even further into 4 different types of teams. And you would want to consider having each type in place as you are developing your multi-tiered systems of support. And that's an individual student team, which would consist of teacher, parent, and child. A classroom team, which would consist of the classroom, the teacher in the classroom, the children in the classroom, as well as any other folks that you collaborate with to create an environment that is inclusive and equitable. A program or grade level team, which is sometimes known as a PLC. That might be an acronym that you're used to, where they talk about programming and grade level goals. And then there's the leadership team, and that would be like your high level school team with your principal, assistant principal, instructional strategists, school counselors, however your program is set up, or whoever you have in your building. Then we move on to the next critical component as a strong educator support system. We talked about that on the previous slide. Layering of supports for all children. And again, there's that S, there's that tricky little plural S there, supports for all children, and that's going to be important. Effective practices, so how we are instructing, how we are intervening, how we are monitoring and you know, assessing and screening, and what we're choosing to use, and are we using it well, right? And so effective practices. And then family and school partnerships. This is a little bit different than family and school engagement, because if I were to put a survey up on the screen right now and asked you to take the survey, you are essentially engaging with that survey, but it's not a partnership, right? Or it's a very loose partnership. So having well-defined family and school partnerships is another critical component of MTSS. But what I'd like to do quickly is a critical component inventory. And so in this activity, which you will find on page 26 momentarily, is think about your educational setting or your school and ask yourself how many of these critical components you have in place already. Are they, and maybe jot a little note about if you don't have it, you know, what you might have to do to get it or what questions you have. And if you do have it, how well is it working? Or is it something that you think could benefit from some revision and change?
So like Andrea said in the beginning, we'll get to the what, we'll get to the why, and we'll get to the what MTSS isn't, right? So we're going to just take a minute and talk about the why MTSS. I went ahead and pulled some data from our state of Maine, and this data comes from the school year 2019-2020. So it's our most recent full and complete school year. So just keep that in mind, as some of these figures may have changed, especially this year in our COVID year, where we've added some other positions to support students. So this does not refer to the school year.
It's not.
So in 2000. Yes, thank you. So in 2019-20 in Maine, we had 215 school administrative units that contributed to this data. Of all those SAUs, over 11,000, so 11,871 certified classroom teachers in pre-K to grade 12. And we had 2,006 certified special education teachers in pre-K to grade 12. So I didn't disaggregate this data down further to see exactly how many special education teachers or how many classroom teachers we had in individual grades necessarily. I wanted to see it more as a broad spectrum. So ultimately, when we do a percentage, it tells us that 14% of our pre-K to 12 staff, so the staff that are spending likely the most amount of time with our students, have only 14% have a special education background. So what, right? So what does this mean? So I want to be really, really clear when I say that MTSS is mentioned before, but I'm going to reiterate. MTSS is not necessarily just about students who qualify for special education, right? And a caveat to that too is, as educators and as administrators of young children, if we have a concern about a child's development, we should always, always, always be collecting that data and talking with the family about making a referral to special education for the services through an IEP if you deem that that's necessary, right? I will never, ever, ever say that we shouldn't do that. The thing about it, though, is that so many of our early childhood educators are regular classroom teachers. They're that 11,000 number, right? Some are really lucky. Some principals are very lucky to have a teacher in the pre-K to third grade realm that has both a regular education and a special education background, but that's not the case everywhere. The other point to make here is that these students, all students, we want them in the regular education setting, not just for the instruction piece of it, because we know that educators, of course, are instructing and making relationships with children, but also for their peers, for their typically developing peers, because they're teaching them too. It gets sticky when we ask regular education classroom teachers to include all students, those with and without concerning behaviors or challenging needs, when they don't have a background in special education, right? When they don't have a speech and language degree or an occupational therapy degree or a behavioral degree. So we're asking them to do things that they might not be ready or confident to take on. So this is where an MTSS system can really support that teacher in that setting, right? The kicker is that that teacher has to recognize that she needs the support, and administrators need to recognize that he or she needs the support, right? So that's where that team approach really comes into play here. And the other kicker too is we know that when we refer students for special education services, they might not always qualify for an IEP. So then what? Right? So that student is still very much a part of our school, very much a part of our classroom, but they're not qualifying to receive services through an IEP that's going to assist them in the classroom. So we're back to the regular ed setting. We're back into the teacher, the certified classroom teacher, and his or her ability to make the accommodations, modifications potentially needed to fully support that child. So let's talk about the numbers of children for a minute. Again, this is 2019-2020 school year. We had 30,758 of our students, so just about 19%, who qualified to receive special education services in kindergarten through 12th grade, okay? That's not pre-K. Pre-K is separate because 619 services for 3 to 5-year-olds are organized through Child Development Services or CDS. It's not part of the regular school system. So therefore they have a bit of a different data system as well. So when we look at just pre-K data, it tells us that 902 of our pre-K students, or just under 15%, had an IEP through CDS during that school year. So again, I was talking earlier about wanting students to be included in their regular ed classroom. So when we look at that, just around 50% of students K-12 who qualify for special ed are in their classroom setting for less than 80% of their day. So remember, most of 1920 was full day, full week programming, right? Like that was our sort of our typical schedule. So less than 80% of their day, almost 13,000 students, were not in a regular ed setting. 17,000 were. Now, about 1,150 received their services in an entirely separate school. So that number does need to come out because they're not part of a regular education setting. Their needs require them to be in a setting that might be a special purpose school. Some are in hospitals, our juvenile system, things like that. However, consistently, of all those 30-some-odd thousand students who receive special ed services, consistently across years, 10 and 11-year-olds make up our highest special education count. So our 4th and 5th graders in the state are tapping that out. So that's a yikes for me for a couple of reasons. Because we're talking about early childhood. We're talking about early childhood intervention. Of course, there are students who are going to qualify for special ed services that are going to need those services for the span of their educational career, right? Depending on their diagnosis and the severity of their needs in a setting, they may or may not have those throughout their whole school career. There are others, however, that the goal is to work them out of special education services. Sometimes they are referred and qualify for speech and language, and with the appropriate interventions and therapies, that student over the course of time could no longer need that, right? That's what early intervention is. That's what we're talking about in the early childhood setting, is getting those students started on a path of success to overcoming some of their potential delays, okay? So if 10 and 11-year-olds are making up our highest special education count, what did we miss, right? That's a yikes from me. So I'm curious if anybody's comfortable to unmute themselves or feel free to use the chat box, but how could these statistics be improved through a multi-tiered system of support?
Well, I can, do you want someone to speak out loud?
That'd be fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you, Kathy.
I'm not sure if this is a right answer or a wrong answer, but
No wrong
I
answer.
know for me, I like the idea of having a team where there are people in different sort of genre that can help, because it is hard as a classroom teacher. I have a literacy master's and a regular certificate and a previous art degree. For me to decide, is this child, there's still always that, are they just young? Will they catch up? And now with the pandemic, of course, that's even a different sort of layer of, okay, are we going to give them this little extra time because we have time to make up? And we do feel that when we put them in special education, they get caught sometimes. And so you're sort of afraid to start that process.
Right. And I know it's true for many educators that, we can't make a referral or get a student set up in a special education service without a family's consent, right? We want to make sure the family's involved. And a lot of times families aren't sure if they want that for their child, right? They could very easily decline a special education service for a number of reasons, right? I won't go down the rabbit hole of why, but it happens. And again, we still have a duty to that student in our setting to include them and whatnot. And in the chat box, Elaine mentioned too that applying an MTS system to a student perhaps in pre-K, even K, even before pre-K, right? Maybe in their childcare setting, could help with early interventions, 100%. And let me elaborate on that a little bit too. Because like I was saying, in a public setting, a certified classroom teacher doesn't necessarily have a background in speech and language, special education, etc. So we can't just make assumptions that that person knows what to do. So we bring in the team, right? So a pre-K teacher should never be afraid to reach out to her school, or I keep saying her, but I mean his or her. I know there are high quality male pre-K teachers out there, so forgive me, please. But I know they should be able to reach out to their public school staff and ask for assistance in that setting. So many times we think that pre-K is this realm over here, and K-12 is in this realm over here, and the two collide and they don't intertwine. When in fact, we're wanting to see more of that, not just through staffing, but through alignment in curriculum, alignment in assessment, alignment in PLCs and trainings, etc. A lot of schools do that really phenomenally, so don't take me wrong there. But that team approach, right? So again, in pre-K, 619 services are provided through CDS. And a lot of times we get in this awful habit and routine of saying, that's not my job, right? I'm not a speech and language therapist, so I can't apply that in my setting. But where we really want to break that mold and say you can. And Andrea's going to touch upon that in a moment as well. Just going to catch myself up in the chat box real quick so that I don't leave anything out.
So also, Nicole, something you said earlier kind of got me wondering if any folks in this room were to take a look, say, at their most recent literacy scores, right? And keeping COVID in mind, I mean, certainly scores today might look differently than scores last March might have looked. But, let's say that you were to look at your data and, 41% of your students are meeting or exceeding expectations, and, 15 or, 23% are in the trouble zone, and then whatever's left is in the red. And so what I'm hearing you say is that essentially across the state we don't even have a 1-to-1 ratio for the special education students versus the people who are actually trained in special education, and all these resources are going to that particular side. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, I'm just pointing it out. And so now we've got even less support on the general education side.
Right. In the other room. Okay, and there were some great comments and additions in the chat box too that I won't reread for folks, but please refer to that as we move on as well. So MTSS in the early childhood setting. So what it is. So I pulled this definition right from Andrea's page on our maine.gov site, her MTSS page, and this is just part of a laundry, not a laundry list, but a longer explanation of MTSS. So it is defined as a comprehensive framework, right, designed to address academic needs, behavioral needs, social emotional needs. And if those three things don't sum up an early child, a young child in an early childhood setting, I'm not sure what else does, because we can all agree that we've worked with students day in and day out on their academic needs, their behavioral needs, their social emotional needs, and this system is really designed to support that as well. And of course, like I was saying, we want each student in the most inclusive and equitable learning environment as well. So when we think of multi-tiered systems of support, let's see, oops, sorry about that. Let's see what we can do about sort of renaming that. So when we think of the word multi, what's another word that also means multi? Feel free to shout it out or use the chat. Many, several. Yep, yep. Perfect. So I could use any of those. I'm just going to pop in many. All right, let's do the same thing for tiered. Another word for tiered. Levels, layers. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to toss in levels. Okay, another word for systems. Design, process. Program, yeah. Program again, structured, yeah. Okay, so let's just toss in programs. Systems are also could be known as programs. And then finally, another word for support. Help, yeah. That was the first one last time too. Help, guidance, yes, exactly. Okay, okay, so we're all on the same page. So now when we think about what is MTSS in the early childhood setting even, this is where we break it down to. We can make it simpler. Multi-tiered systems of support is the same thing as many levels of programs that help, right? It doesn't have the same flow, but it certainly means the same thing when we have students in our classroom, all students. We want to provide them with as many levels of programs, of systems, of help, of support as we can, as many as we have in our toolbox. That's what we want to be providing. Okay. So hopefully that helps to sort of simplify it a little bit as far as what it is and what it is in the early childhood setting.
So what MTSS isn't? It isn't a single program, right? It's not something that you go out and buy. It's not something that you add on to what you're doing. It's really more of a reorganizing of the resources that you already have, figuring out if you have too many, figuring out if you need to add some, but it is not a program. Second misconception is that MTSS is the new RTI. Oh God, it's like a gut punch when I hear that. People are like, you know, I'm trying to start a new RTI and I thought MTSS could help me. Well, yes, MTSS can help you, but if you want to do an RTI, that's going to be a whole different question. So because it's not, yes, RTI has in the past for many, many years, I mean, we're going on almost 40 years of RTI, you know, 35 or 40 years of some form of RTI. And it often is used as a system in itself when really, if you break it down, response to intervention, it's really just what was the RTI? It's almost like it's almost a noun more than it is a verb. And so MTSS is not that. RTI is part of that, but it's not that. Misconception number 3 is that MTSS is only for struggling students, and that could not be farther from the truth. You know, oftentimes we use something called RTI to help target and support struggling students, but we're taking the lens and we're bringing it way out so that MTSS is a support system for all children and not struggling students. And then misconception number 4 is that MTSS is a special education referral process. And I really valued something that someone just said. I didn't take note of your name, but you were like, you know, sometimes you kind of hem and haw because once a child gets into one of these support systems, it is very difficult to get them out, primarily because the classroom is working at such a faster pace. And then when you're trying to fill in holes, it just, you know, it really just, the gap just, in a lot of ways, the gap just continues to grow and grow and grow. And so we've really missed an opportunity to close the gap, even though our intention all along was to close the gap. And so thinking about that in a different way, and you're right, you know, you get a child into something that looks like a Title I program, an RTI program, or a, you know, whatever that winds up being called in your classroom or in your school, that it's basically just a long-winded referral process. And we really want to start moving away from that. There are always going to be children that need to be referred. There are always going to be children that have special education needs. You know, but what we're going to try to do is really help provide additional supports for teachers so that we can really start to even distinguish even further and let those that truly need those intense interventions, and let them rise to the, you know, rise to the top, the cream of the crop kind of thing, right? You know, the cream rises to the top. And while we are still equally supporting those that, you know, are just kind of generally in the, you know, in the mix of, you know, of life and of the world. So we're going to dig deeper into the what. And so I'm going to throw out 4 words to you. And then I'm going to have you just take a quick reflection point and go back to your original question of what is MTSS and what you answered, and ask yourself, did you use any of these words in your answer? And if not, how might you revise your answer to reflect these concepts? And those are intentional. And MTSS is intentional, and it's done well before, it's set up and pre-planned well before a child even walks into the building. And 80% of the work that you're going to do comes before you even step foot or get face-to-face with a child. It's preventative. So every decision that you make is intended to be in a preventative measure rather than a reactive measure, right? So to assume that you're going to have a school year where you're never going to have a child with a behavior problem, you're never going to have a child with a reading problem, you're never going to have a child with this problem or that problem or another problem is naive. Because if they come every year, these kids, they come to us and they want help, they want to learn, and they want to succeed. So we have to plan for that. We have to and have those systems in place prior to, because we know they're coming. It's predictive. Like if they're coming, we know it. MTSS is inclusive, and it's also very people first. It's not numbers first. It's not data first. It's not program first. It's people first. And sometimes I think as educators, we want to do so well and have good numbers so that we can report good numbers that we let the numbers drive our decisions. And we got to pull that lens back again and make it people first. So I'm going to stop talking for a couple of minutes while you go back and see if there's anything in your original answer that you might be able to revise based on what we have covered so far in today's session. So what? Right? I mean, Nicole talked a little bit about the so what, and then we're going to come back and look at it just a little bit deeper. So why should I care about MTSS? Well, because there aren't enough resources. That's one really good reason about why you should care about MTSS. 2, because teachers are tired. Teacher fatigue, folks. It's there, it's real. You all, some of you are experiencing it. If you're an administrator, you know it. And, you know, one of the things that I think, you know, with teacher fatigue is, you know, we often think of it as, you know, something that, you know, interferes with, you know, they're just, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm trying to say, but I guess what I'm really trying to say is that one of the reasons why, in a way, it is so hard to get children out of a tiered system of support or like a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention or a Title I program. And one of those reasons is that teachers are tired, right? They've probably been dealing with lots of things. And when that child doesn't qualify for special education, they've already exhausted all of their resources on the inside. And so we've got to have a plan. We've got to know how to support these teachers to reduce that fatigue. Another reason why is because there will always be children who challenge us. Always. It will always happen. And so to, again, assume that that's not going to happen is to throw the baby out with the bathwater, you know, basically. It's really important that we start thinking about, instead of reacting, which is kind of funny because we're one of the things that we focus on is the response to the intervention that we might put in place. We're actually kind of thinking like in the reverse, like how can we prevent it rather than respond to it? And so that's, it's just a little bit different of a question as you work through that thought process. Another reason is because the whole is greater than the parts. You know, when we look at the whole school, if we can get the whole school less siloed, less pocketed, and running more as a cohesive system, that is going to be greater than trying to mitigate individual groups of children or like larger, you know, one-on-one and single children and that kind of thing. And I'm not saying that that's not needed. Please don't take that. That is absolutely needed. But it may not be the most direct way to get to better scores, better climate, teacher fatigue, and those kinds of things. And really, it comes down to one big thing. And that's because what we're doing isn't working for everyone. And that is just the brass tacks of it. Because if it was, when prevention programs and RTI programs and respond to the problem programs and problem-oriented solving and that kind of thing, when it emerged 35 years ago, 40 years ago, we wouldn't still be talking about it. It would have worked. So whatever it is that we're doing, it's just not working for everyone. And we got to start to see what are the root causes? Why is it not working? And what are the changes, whether it be mindset changes, whether it be instructional changes, whether it be educational changes in terms of how we train our teachers, right? Something is not helping the system because it's not working for everyone. So one of the things that I like to say when a school comes to me and they're super frustrated because they're trying to do RTI, they're trying to help these kids, they're trying. And really what I have noticed that is when things start to fall apart, it really comes down to what I call the 3 Ps. And that's people, planning, and partnerships, okay? And so it's whether you've planned, it's the partnerships that you form, it's the planning that you've done, and it's the people that you're utilizing. And that's really important because sometimes we tend to pigeonhole titles of people into certain spaces, but we don't necessarily look at their something else that they may be passionate about or do really well. And so it really comes down to people, planning, and partnerships. And which I can point you back to that crash course at another time, exists in phases 1 and 2. That's the planning. That's the resources and the planning and things like that. The people is phases 1 and 2, and 80% of that is going to go into the first half of implementation science. So more effort rather than equal effort. 80% of an MTSS framework happens before a student ever walks into the building. And we talked about that a little while ago when we talked about what MTSS wasn't. 80% of the effort inside of the building or inside of the program should be on tier 1. And if you're not reaching that 80%, there are some questions that need to be asked about fidelity, instruction, interventions, effective practices, and those kinds of things. We can't just stop talking about that and go straight to the struggling children. We have to really ask, why is 80% not here? And then 80% of our students should be able to make adequate growth and yearly progress in a tier 1 setting. That's what the research says. That's what every curriculum that is research-based, evidence-based says. I mean, it is what we are shooting for. And so we have to stop looking at the things that we have sometimes seen as barriers to say, well, we aren't at 80% because we have a lot of poverty, or we aren't at 80% because we have a lot of English language learners, or et cetera, et cetera. We got to start looking at it as okay, we know we have these groups of children. We got to start planning for them so that we can get those kids up to 80%. And so we're going to talk about readiness and capacity for true MTSS, and we're going to talk about all of that. But really, we're going to do some assessing and things like that. But when it comes to readiness and capacity for a true MTSS implementation, it starts with you, folks. It starts with numero uno. Who is inside you, and what do you bring to the table? You are the biggest asset to a well-implemented MTSS framework. But on the flip side, you can also be its biggest barrier. There's a quote on the screen that we actually did not talk about. So we will maybe incorporate that into a later time. But, you know, it's just very important for us to realize that, you know, we can have all the partnerships in the world and all the best people in the world and all the right people and as many people as we need. But unless we really look at ourselves and what we bring to the framework, then we're not really truly ready to engage in this really hard but super important work.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you now to channel your inner Michael Jackson and start with the man in the mirror, right? So we're going to just take a minute, reflect on you, yourself, and I, and take a good, long, hard look and start to reflect on what you bring as an individual, as an educator, whatever your role is, what you're bringing into that setting. So there's a book that I really love, and it's written by Michelle Salcido, and it's, I don't have the title, but I can email it to you. In that book, she talks about addressing our own hot buttons. So teachers are human beings, and it's impossible to turn off personal preferences and pet peeves just because one is responsible for the care and education of a group of children. So these pet peeves, they're often referred to as hot buttons. They're behaviors that are viewed as particularly behaviors that are viewed as particularly egregious by one teacher may not even register as a challenge to another. Okay, so when you have a student in your classroom who's a high achiever, okay, this student is above and beyond the developmental expectations of their age group, and they're posing as a challenge to you, right? Not all challenges are negative. Not all hot buttons have a negative connotation. Sometimes a really positive attribute about a student can cause a challenge within you as an educator, okay? And it could spark some feelings, spark some emotions of like, I can't do this, or I'm not ready for this. On the flip side, a student, as we know, can present with a behavior that's challenging in its own right, and it might really just get under your skin and irk you. But it doesn't mean it does that to another teacher, right? That same child, under the guidance of another educator, could be doing the exact same behaviors, and it never registers as a challenge whatsoever. So in this next activity, we're going to take a moment to reflect on your hot buttons. So we're going to use the examples that I'm going to show you on the next slide. There's quite a few of them. I'm going to flip through them one at a time. So once it's all full, then we'll start. We're going to anonymously stamp which ones trigger unwanted or negative feelings within yourself, okay? So the other point to this, to show that maybe you're not alone, or perhaps that one, again, behavior that triggers an unwanted feeling within you might not another educator. So we're going to use, I had mentioned in the intro slides, that annotate. You might not all have access to annotate. It could depend on which version of Zoom you're on. If you don't worry about it. It's totally fine. Just do kind of keep a mental note of where you're at. If you do have it, you'll find it down on the bottom. Well, mine's on the bottom, my Zoom bar. Some might have it at the top. But on your Zoom bar, there should be a little box that has a pencil that says annotate. If you don't see it there, it might be under more, and it might show up in your list of more. So when you click on annotate, it's going to bring up a new little screen, and you should see one for a stamp, and you'll see a star, a check mark, a heart, all different things. So you can choose which one you want. So this next slide, I'm going to pop up some hot buttons and we'll get going. Being late, clinginess, clutter. Oops, I got to move your face here, Andrea. Crying, hitting and kicking, swearing, tattling, getting off schedule, not following instructions, yelling, being interrupted, and whining. So these are clearly just a few. We could probably make a big old list of these. I'm going to get myself a stamp, hopefully, and stamp with you. So you can see everybody's stamps starting to show up, and just take a minute to see which ones you're clicking on and which ones other folks are clicking on. And then take a minute too to think about why this particular behavior or action bothers you.
One thing I also noticed too is that there's multiple stamps on some of these hot buttons, so you're not alone.
Mm-hmm. Big difference too from Monday's group when we did this activity. Not a big difference, but I'm seeing, remember on Monday there was a lot more on getting off schedule, for example, that a lot of our educators that were with us, that really irked them, and along with some of the others as well. Okay, I'm going to clear the annotations in just like 10 seconds. So the being late one is interesting as well to me, because a being late hot button, that could register with you as an internal, like you yourself hate to be late and pride yourself on being on time. And for some of us, I'm curious, you don't have to answer this. I just kind of choose my thinking, I guess. If the being late hot button is when others are late, right? So if you're scheduling a meeting with a family or scheduling a staff meeting and folks show up late, if that's what it is that irks you. It doesn't matter either way right now for this activity. It's just something to consider. So as you think about which ones of these you're stamping, also be thinking about what happens to you physically when these behaviors are present. So if a student not following instructions in that lower left-hand corner, the picture there of the boys laying on the floor, if that's something that you stamped, what do you do? How do you react? What are you bringing to that space when the students are not following instructions, right? Does your face turn to an angry face, irritated, frustrated? Does your body language say, I understand you're not following instructions? Or does your body language say, why aren't you following instructions? You should be doing what the rest of the class is, right? So just be cognizant of what you're bringing to a team, what you're bringing to your space. So on that same annotation bar over on the right, there's a red X. When you're ready, you can go ahead and close out of there, and I'm going to clear these. So for behaviors that push your hot buttons, there are a few strategies that can be helpful. So the first one is to be honest with yourself and others about your hot buttons. So in the early childhood space, a lot of our classrooms have ed techs that come and go, perhaps. Some of them have ed techs that are there for the entirety of the day. Be honest with your co-teacher about what your hot buttons are. You know, it really irritates me when I have a whole group read aloud and that one student always leaves, or that one student always sits on his belly instead of sitting crisscross applesauce, and see what their reaction is. I'd be curious of how that conversation goes, because my response to that would be, so what? If that child's not hurting himself, if he's not hurting his neighbors, and if he just needs to be removed, if the whole group space is not his thing right now and he needs to sit behind or sit somewhere else, see what happens if you let that go. Another strategy is to recognize that a behavior that pushes your hot buttons is about you, not the child. So in many cases, that child is not trying to ruffle your feathers, right? If you're giving them a reaction, then they might be trying to, perhaps. But it's more about you and what irritates you, and sort of recognizing and perhaps overcoming that if it's necessary. And a third strategy is to communicate with a co-teacher. So similar to number one, however, this one explains that we could have a code word perhaps that lets him or her know that you need support in addressing a behavior that feels especially challenging to you. So that person can also use the word to let you know when you need to walk away from a situation. So you're out on the playground, a student is flailing on the ground and not moving, and that's one of your hot buttons. That's a moment when you really get clammy and angry because the child's not following instructions, and all of a sudden you hear your co-teacher say, "How about them Red Sox?" And they know that's your code to say, "Oh, okay, this is I need to walk away. She's going to trade out with me here and give me a moment." Okay, so be mindful of this as we work through.
Yeah, Nicole, if you want to just go back to that previous slide, I just want to build, you said something that made me think of that whole, one of the P's of partnerships, right? And one thing that I know that I was never given as an educator when I was in a school setting is the ability to be honest with others about what my hot buttons were. I was expected to just deal with everyone, everything all the time and be able to put that stuff aside, right? And so I often wonder how we could better prepare our teaming partnerships and our group partnerships if, you know, if two people in the same room have the same hot buttons, that's not good, right? And so, but we got to know what the hot buttons are. So allowing a teacher to have a preference or to be able to say, you know, listen, I really, this is something that I'm working on. It would be really great if I could be paired with this person or that person. And often we're not given that opportunity to do that. We're just expected to be everything for everyone. And that leads us to the next idea is that, why do my hot buttons get in the way? You know, a lot of people and myself, you know, I'm an adult. I should be able to control those. And many times we are asked to control those without even giving them the time of day that they need in order to be addressed with. And this is called cognitive bias, or otherwise known as like rules of thumb, right? These are things that are ingrained in us that, that will get in our way. And so we're gonna take a few minutes and go through just a couple of these cognitive biases, and especially the ones that are really prevalent in education. And so one of them is, well, this slide basically just says that, you know, in order to be able to address our cognitive bias, we have to be able to name them. And if we can't name them, then, you know, we may as well just watch the fire burn, right? There's an analogy up there on the top of that slide, but I'm not going to get into that today because we are getting out of time. When we think about addressing our cognitive bias, we tend to try and do it one of two ways. The first way is to ignore it, right? We're expected to ignore it. We try to ignore it. Well, I am who I am. People don't change. Or this was the way I was taught, and so this is the way I will teach, right? And if somebody goes against that grain, it can get us going, right? The other thing we might try to do is prevent the bias by, you know, taking a professional development or reading a self-help book or making a resolution. You know, I'm not going to let this get in my way. But without a plan, without like actually thinking about and planning for the times that these come up and what you're going to do when they come up, you really can't prevent them, right? So it really comes back to that naming piece and being able to name them. And so one of the first really prevalent biases in education is called an attribution bias. And this is when we attempt to explain something that is generally uncomfortable in us because it's uncomfortable and we want to get back to that comfortable space, right? And so it's in a way to explain things that don't feel well with us. And that can range from everything from one of those behaviors that we were looking at, but even like kids that struggle to read. You know, if you're a child, if one of those things is just really frustrating for you, you may find yourself, you know, trying to find an intervention for them or find another placement for them or that kind of thing. And that exists, right? You know, if trouble reading is something that sets you off, that's okay. It's okay. But we need to be able to address that. So attribution bias, how it helps you is it helps you get the fastest path possible out of an uncomfortable situation. How does it harm others? It dehumanizes us to think and respond in labels rather than people first approaches, and it can prevent critical thinking. The next bias in education that I wanted to talk about was confirmation bias. And with confirmation bias, this generally appears right on the heels of attribution bias. And so where attribution bias gets us out of an uncomfortable situation, Confirmation bias is its buddy, and it comes right in and says, yes, you are validated. Look at how often that child flops, or look at how often that child clings to your leg. That child is clingy. That child has problems. That child has to do X, Y, and Z. And so we start to seek out additional information to help us make more sense of what's happening. But the information that we seek tends to be filtered in a way that is just set up to confirm our previous bias. And it really gives us no ability to look for other problems, right? So how does this help you? It validates your attribution bias by helping you feel right or justified for believing or feeling a certain way. And how does this harm others? Well, the big thing here is that it's that critical thinking piece again, but it really can inhibit problem solving, because if you're not able to work through that and get to the other side, then you're really going to have a hard time solving that problem, and that problem is going to keep coming again and again and again. The next one is availability bias, and this happens sometimes with things like, maybe you're, it's where you try to provide a solution to something that is happening. It's also known as the solution effect. And again, this is another, it's like a mind trick. It's like a quick fix, like get rich quick kind of thing, where it gives you the quickest solution to a problem without giving you time to think about other solutions. Or if you have said, well, I thought about all the other solutions and they didn't work. Well, uh-oh, there's your confirmation bias again, because you were probably looking for it to not work, maybe. So those are some things that we do. And guess what, guys? It's human nature. It really is. It's not that we're trying to be awful. It's not that we're trying to be closed-minded, or that we're trying not to problem solve. It's just something that happens, and we generally don't realize it's happening until after it's happened, right? Even if we're aware of it at all. And so how does availability bias help you? Well, it basically relieves you of any burden that might be impeding your own goals. So if your goal is to have, if your goal is to teach children how to read, and you have a child that is really struggling to learn how to read, your first attempt is to try and find something else that is available to help them, because that is getting in the way of your teaching the other children of how to read, for example. And so it really kind of helps you release that burden on yourself. How does it harm others? Well, it can prolong access to actual solutions. It can elevate issues into things that we think are much bigger, but actually aren't. And it can really dismiss the actual needs of others. And so one of the outcomes of biases is called the halo effect, or the horns effect. And a halo effect is a characteristic. It's when one characteristic about a child determines how you positively view them. And it allows you to filter out any negative characteristics, right? And so once that child has the halo effect, they could probably be doing one of the same hot button behaviors as another child, but you're more willing to overlook it because it might be out of character, or because that child does this really well, or you had a positive experience with them, or whatever it might be. On the opposite side of that is the horns effect. And the horns effect is when one or more characteristics of a person determines how you negatively view them. And then that one actually prevents you from filtering out any positive characteristics. So if you've got a child that always ruffles your feathers, is always hitting your hot buttons, over time, you're going to start to inadvertently view them negatively. You're going to invoke the horns effect. And even when that child does something really, really good, it might feel good for an instant, but it isn't likely to be long lasting. And so because you will be using your confirmation bias to constantly seek out the information of that kind of confirms that negative view of them. And so you can see how they kind of all work together to create some issues inside our own selves that we need to be aware of as we are thinking about what we bring to a school setting and to our programs. Attribution error effect is one of those things where it's when you have given an attribute to someone else and you're using an external reason for that attribute rather than the internal reason that that person might be experiencing, right? So for example, if you're always late, or if I'm always late to a meeting, you might say, well, she's disorganized and she's not you know, she's never on time, or she never has the right materials, or, you know, she never puts gas in her car, or whatever it is. And so you're liable to use an external reason to confirm that attribute of always being late or always being lazy or something like that, versus what might be happening. So let's say internally that person is always late to meetings because for whatever reason, they have a child at home that flops on the floor all the time, right? And they're just trying to balance being a mom or a dad versus, you know, getting to work on time. And the person that's struggling is expecting you to know the internal reason. And the person that is upset is expecting you to know that they're upset with you because of an external reason, right? And so there's an error here. And that's just sort of demonstrated for you on this slide as well. So like take that child that's flopping, for example. You know, you might be like, well, he just wants to get out of math. You know, he might be floppy because he's avoiding. And that could very well be true. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen. But on the inside, so you're putting in an external, you know, you're like the avoidance, right? That external piece, or you know, the attention that he's getting from it or something like that. Whereas on the inside of that child, he could be flopping on the floor because he's so tired because his baby brother cried all night, right? And so he's thinking, if I lay on the floor, my teacher's going to know it's because I'm tired. Whereas you might be thinking it's because he wants to get out of something. Again, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, that avoidance doesn't happen. It absolutely does. But we have to be careful to balance what the internal is versus what the external is. That brings us to our exit ticket. So previously for your entrance ticket, where you were asked to roll a die and to generate a small group of people, we are going to challenge you to think about and synthesize everything that we've covered today, which is a lot. I mean, this was a really content heavy day. So I don't know if many of you feel, you know, plowed, but I definitely feel plowed right now. Is, you know, what we would like you to do is take a look at, did we want to give them a specific one? Oh, student number 2. So profile number 2. Okay, so think about profile number 2 and what profile and what characteristics that child is bringing to your educational setting, and compare that to maybe what you're bringing to the educational setting. And then really think about those people, planning, and partnership pieces that you might be able to put together as you design a multi-tiered system of support that is created to support this child, right?